When white opens the game with d4 instead of the solid d5 or knight f6, fighting for control over the important e4 square. A more radical approach is to play f5, turning the game into the Dutch defense. f5 does fight for control over the e4 square, but it doesn't help develop a piece, and it also leaves the king vulnerable on the e8 to h5 diagonal. This may also be a concern if black decides to castle kingside, which is often the case, as the king may be exposed on the a2 to g8 diagonal. So why exactly would black willingly do this? The Dutch defense immediately imbalances the pawn structure from the very first move, setting the stage for a dynamic, sharp struggle. The f-pawn may also be used to help charge a kingside attack, especially as white typically castles on that side of the board. White definitely shouldn't panic when seeing this provocative move, nor should white expect an easy game based upon this anti-positional approach. Unlike most mainline d4 openings when white's most popular plan is seizing more space in the center with c4, followed by knight c3. Although this is still a valid approach to consider, white's main response against the Dutch does not involve this setup. White's light-squared bishop often likes to find activity on the d3 square, supporting the center while pointing toward black's kingside. In the Dutch defense, however, the f5 pawn restricts the activity of this important minor piece. White's most popular response to the Dutch is to activate the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal, starting with g3, preparing to meet knight f6, with bishop g2. The light-squared bishop exerts serious pressure down the long diagonal, adding pressure against black's queenside while helping fight for control over the central light squares. The light-squared bishop will likely serve as an important defender of the castled king. This means that white will have to keep an eye out for a well-timed f4, trying to rip open lines on the kingside in some of the more aggressive Dutch defense variations. We're going to introduce three of black's most common variations played in practice, starting with the most outwardly aggressive option, the Leningrad Dutch, which is based upon fianchettoing the dark-squared bishop, starting with g6. Committing to a second pawn move softens black's kingside, but fully in accordance with the fighting spirit of the Dutch, black is not worried about accepting positional liabilities, preferring to maximize piece play by activating the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal. A straightforward continuation for both sides is to complete kingside development with knight f3, bishop g7, followed by both sides castling kingside. In the Leningrad Dutch, black's main idea is to play d6, preparing the central pawn break e5, confronting white's center, when not only can the e-pawn contemplate advancing to e4 in the future, it also supports the pawn break f4, trying to rip open lines on the f-file. With the e5 pawn break in mind, one option to explore is b3, preparing bishop b2, fighting for control over the e5 square. White's main response is to simply grab more central space with c4. When black continues with d6, we reach the main line of the Leningrad Dutch after knight c3. White simply continues to actively develop while fighting for central control. The interested viewer may explore activity on the c6 square either with c6, restricting white's light-squared bishop on the long diagonal, or the provocative knight c6, preparing to support the pawn break e5, which will likely provoke the double-edged d5 advance, attacking black's knight, but also softening squares down the long dark-squared diagonal. The most classical response, however, is queen e8, supporting the thematic pawn break e5. If black decides to expand on the kingside with h6 and g5, this also opens a path for the queen to join the kingside initiative from either g6 or h5. White has an important decision to make, whether or not to allow black's thematic pawn break e5. The traditional response has been to discourage e5 with the space-gaining d5, preparing to meet the now mistaken pawn thrust e5. With en passant, d takes e6. It may appear black's position is about to come to life after bishop takes e6, activating the light-squared bishop as it threatens the c4 pawn. But black is in for a rude awakening after knight d4, attacking black's bishop while revealing the fianchettoed bishop's potential down the long diagonal, threatening the b7 pawn. Now that d5 rules out e5 for the time being, black can try to exploit some of the drawbacks this strong positional clamp has created, namely no longer protecting the c5 square, as well as opening the long dark-squared diagonal. The space-gaining a5 is one interesting move worth exploring, but black may also decide to immediately play knight a6. eyeing the newly weakened c5 square. In most Dutch defense lines, white is seeking to achieve a favorable e4 pawn break, preparing to open up lines in the center. In this case, opening up the e-file would highlight the backward e7 pawn. One attempt to achieve this plan is by centralizing the knight with knight d4. Eyeing sensitive light squares in black's camp while revealing the light-squared bishop's support of a possible e4 pawn break. White is trying to apply a positional squeeze, but black's position remains quite resilient. A typical plan for black is to allow white's desired e4 pawn break by playing bishop d7, joining the queen and preparing c6, adding serious pressure against white's center. By playing c6, this also creates the possibility of knight c7, intensifying the pressure against d5. It's also possible for black's knight to continue its journey with knight c5, fighting for control over the center. In one Grandmaster encounter, Grandmaster Peter Svidler played the modest b3, building a light-squared queenside pawn chain while preparing to contest the long diagonal with bishop b2. His opponent, Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, utilized the popular plan to generate counterplay with bishop d7 and c6, setting the stage for a tense middle game struggle. b3 is a solid option, but it's tempting to lash out by advancing this pawn 2 squares forward, attacking the knight, but weakening the long dark square diagonal in the process. If black responds passively, this could lead to serious trouble, but black has the active resource knight f to e4, counterattacking the newly unprotected c3 knight while revealing the Leningrad bishop's pressure down the long diagonal. Black's idea is to meet knight takes e4, with knight takes e4. The dark-squared bishop is making its presence known on the long diagonal when black is prepared to strike in the center with c5, leading to sharp, double-edged play. Instead of playing knight d4 immediately, another popular plan for white is to play rook b1. The rook vacates the dangerous long dark-squared diagonal, escaping potential tactical issues from the Leningrad bishop on g7. The rook also prepares to support the space-gaining b4. A key battleground emerges after bishop d7, preparing to meet b4, with c6, adding pressure against the d5 pawn while opening up the possibility of knight c7, increasing the tension in the center. White typically clears a pair of pawns from the long diagonal with d takes c6, b takes c6. The battle lines are drawn between white's queenside initiative and black's central pawn mass. White would love to combine b5 with knight d4, applying serious light-squared pressure on the queenside. Achieving e5 is a dream scenario for black, although e5 would currently hang the d6 pawn. It's not uncommon to contemplate ideas such as knight c7 and rook d8, preparing to expand in the center, especially if e5 proves tactically justified. The space-gaining d5 is a popular way to challenge the Leningrad Dutch. When facing Dutch variations in which black prepares e5, another popular idea is responding to this move with e4. With this in mind, white can play rook e1. It's possible for black to play queen f7, removing the queen from the dangerous e-file while attacking the unprotected c4 pawn. This is an interesting idea worth exploring. But if black decides to play the straightforward e5, white may continue with d takes e5, followed by e4, or simply maintain the tension and strike in the center immediately with e4. As the tension in the center comes to a boiling point, black may want to maintain the tension for another moment with knight c6, allowing white to open up the e-file as planned with e takes f5, when black is ready to activate the light-squared bishop with bishop takes f5, setting the stage for a sharp middle game struggle. Resolving the tension with e takes d4 is not a good idea, as this is strongly met by e takes f5, revealing the rook's attack against the queen, followed by centralizing the knight and capturing the pawn with knight takes d4, leading to an excellent game for white. And if black decides to capture the other pawn with f takes e4, instead of playing the automatic knight takes e4, white has the instructive resource d takes e5, attacking black's knight. D takes e5 isolates this pawn on the e-file when white is prepared to play knight g5, intending to regain the pawn with knight g takes e4, enjoying a tremendous positional advantage. If black decides to capture the knight with e takes f3, now attacking the light-squared bishop, the rook on e1 proves its value after e takes f6, regaining the piece while attacking black's queen, Since the dark squared bishop is also hanging, black's position is falling apart. The Leningrad Dutch with g6 is black's sharpest option, so it's no surprise that this variation is relied upon when black is playing for a win at all costs. The Leningrad Dutch typically prepares to strike in the center with d6 and e5. A similar approach can be found in the classical Dutch, except black decides to develop the dark squared bishop to the more modest e7 square. We head toward the classical Dutch after the moves e6, the typical space gaining c4, and bishop e7. White typically continues to develop in the same fashion as we saw in the Leningrad with knight f3, when both sides may castle kingside. This move order may also lead to the Stonewall Dutch if black decides to play d5, a variation we'll introduce in a moment. We officially reach the classical Dutch after black commits to the move d6, preparing to support the central pawn break e5. White's most popular reply is to activate the other knight with knight c3. When black has an important decision to make, we've already seen ideas where white grabs more space on the queen side with b4, and this is very much a possibility in the classical Dutch as well. With this in mind, black may decide to play a5, discouraging white's queenside initiative before focusing on the central break e5. Queen e8 is also an interesting option, sharing some similarities to the Leningrad. The queen eyes the g6 and h5 squares to help support a potential kingside initiative. Moving the queen to e8 vacates the d8 square, making the strange-looking bishop d8 a possibility, supporting the newly unprotected c7 pawn. Moving the bishop off the e-file helps the queen support a potential e5 pawn break. This is usually not so easy to accomplish as white can once again rely on the powerful plan of rook e1, preparing to open up the center with e4. Since the e4 pawn break is such an effective plan, supporters of black's cause have gravitated attention toward the provocative knight lunge, knight e4, provoking an immediate central confrontation as the knight occupies the very square white's e-pawn would like to use to blast open the center. White's traditional reply has been queen c2, challenging black's knight on e4. d5 enters a Stonewall Dutch position down a tempo, as black has invested 2 moves to advance the pawn to d5. White has several promising options, including supporting c4 with b3, or emphasizing the weakened dark squares the d5 pawn has created with bishop f4, gaining strong central control. Rather than spending a second tempo on the d-pawn, black typically exchanges knights with knight takes c3. Preserving the structure with queen takes c3 is certainly possible, preparing to complete development with b3 and bishop b2, leading to a solid game for white. That being said, black should not fear this line and may consider the space-gaining a5. It's also possible to confront white's queen on the long diagonal with bishop f6, and depending on how white responds, preparing the pawn break c5 or e5. Instead of capturing the knight with the queen, another interesting option is b takes c3. In exchange for slightly compromising the pawn structure, white is ready to strike in the center with e4. Black's most popular response is knight c6, preparing to meet e4 with e5, fighting for central space while revealing the light-squared bishop's protection of the f5 pawn. A more critical test is to play the other central strike d5, when black's knight targets white's weakened c4 pawn with knight a5. In one high-level encounter, Grandmaster Ding Liren continued with d takes e6, preparing to meet bishop takes e6, intensifying the pressure against the c4 pawn, with the strong positional resource knight d4, centralizing the knight, attacking the light-squared bishop while joining the queen's pressure against the f5 pawn. This knight move also awakens the light-squared bishop down the long diagonal. Black should continue with bishop takes c4, when after knight takes f5, the game becomes quite complicated, although white's ability to build pressure against black's compromised kingside should not be underestimated. Queen c2 is an important line to analyze, but it's worth noting that white has a more direct way to challenge knight e4 by first exchanging knights. When after f takes e4, attracting the pawn to the vulnerable e4 square. Instead of moving the knight to d2, which is certainly possible, a more harmonious path is knight e1, revealing the bishop's attack against the unprotected e4 pawn, when after black protects the pawn with d5. Not only can white play f3 immediately, we can also appreciate a benefit of placing the knight on e1. It does not restrict the dark-squared bishop, allowing the additional resource, bishop e3, supporting the center while preparing to activate the rook on the c-file. Once the center is stabilized, this increases the strength of f3, destroying black's central bind when black's position is becoming quite critical. Instead of playing bishop e7 and d6, leading to the classical Dutch, black may prefer to build a light square stonewall structure with c6, preparing to meet the natural knight f3. With d5, black builds a rock-solid light square stonewall pawn structure, restricting white's light-squared bishop while also clamping down on the e4 square, the key pawn break we introduced in the Leningrad and classical variations. This opening sets the stage for extended positional maneuvering, although there is certainly still room for dynamic play to emerge if both sides are willing. The drawbacks to this stonewall structure include restricting the light-squared bishop, as well as the dark square weaknesses it leaves behind, especially the e5 square. This is often a desirable outpost square for a white knight, as it cannot be harassed by enemy pawns. After building the stonewall structure with d5, it appears white's c4 pawn is under serious pressure, but white may decide to simply castle. If black tries to win a pawn with d takes c4, dreaming of reinforcing this pawn with b5, one strong reply is knight e5, adding pressure against the c4 and c6 pawns while opening up the powerful light-squared bishop. If black tries to reinforce the c4 pawn with b5, not only can white explore the powerful shot a4, undermining black's structure, regaining the pawn immediately with knight takes c6 is a simple solution, awakening the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal. Rather than allowing the stonewall to crumble with the greedy d takes c4, black sometimes decides to play the somewhat passive bishop e7, but this bishop has found a more active life in modern times with bishop d6. The dark-squared bishop exerts its influence between the stonewall pawns, and it's also an important piece to help manage some of black's dark square weaknesses. The bishop also eyes the king side, which may help support a future f4 pawn advance if black is ready to build an initiative on that side of the board. White would love to favorably exchange dark-squared bishops, as this would intensify black's dark-squared insecurities. Bishop f4 is a radical way to promote this plan, although after bishop takes f4 and g takes f4, white's kingside structure is somewhat compromised, encouraging black to fight for a kingside initiative, often associated with an eventual g5 pawn break. A more positional way to encourage an exchange of dark-squared bishops is by playing b3. Supporting the c4 pawn while preparing bishop a3, rather than castling, allowing white to continue with bishop a3, which is by no means the end of the world for black. A more active choice is queen e7, centralizing the queen while discouraging bishop a3. If white wants to insist on exchanging dark-squared bishops, a4 is possible, creating a backward b3 pawn in the process. In this case, a5 is a strong response, fixing the queenside structure, leading to an interesting positional struggle. A more common path is to play bishop b2, supporting the center while increasing control over the e5 square. We reach a critical moment in the stonewall. It's possible for black to castle, when an older method to develop the light-squared bishop relied upon the maneuver bishop d7, e8 to h5, adding pressure against white's kingside. A more modern interpretation was demonstrated by world champion Magnus Carlsen, an occasional supporter of the Stonewall Dutch, by playing b6, preparing to support the center with bishop b7 when the bishop may later come to life after a well-timed c5 pawn break. His opponent, Grandmaster Fabiano Caruana, continued with the active knight e5. The knight plants itself in the center of the board, adding pressure against the c6 pawn, while revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure down the long diagonal. The knight also clears the f3 square, which may later be used to prepare to open lines in the center with f3 and e4, although this may prove easier said than done. Magnus continued with bishop b7, when Fabiano activated his other knight with knight d2, supporting the center without obstructing the c-file, a detail we'll appreciate on the next move. White is prepared to meet kingside castling by increasing pressure down the c-file with rook c1. This is a clever move because it's all too easy for black to fall into a positional trap after the natural knight b to d7. Developing the last minor piece, continuing to fight for central control. This actually turns out to be inaccurate as white can play the instructive c takes d5, revealing the rook's pressure against c6. so e takes d5 would simply lose a pawn to knight takes c6. The point is that after c takes d5, since the knight on d7 obstructs the queen's protection of the light-squared bishop, white can play knight d to c4, taking advantage of the pinned d5 pawn, as d takes c4 would allow bishop takes b7, attacking the rook on a8 while black's pawn on c4 is hanging, only to mention a couple of black's problems. If black tries to maintain the dark-squared bishop with a move such as bishop c7, this allows the skewer bishop a3, attacking the queen and rook. Moving the bishop to b4 is well met by a3, when black has to find energetic resources just to stay afloat. Rather than playing the positionally dubious knight b to d7, Grandmaster Carlsen demonstrated a more positive path starting with a5, seizing more queenside space when after white reinforced the center with e3, supporting d4 while also adding additional protection to the f4 square. The final black minor piece enters the action after knight a6, eyeing the b4 and c5 squares. We have reached a typical tension-filled Stonewall Dutch position. Not even a single pawn has been exchanged during the first 12 moves of the game. White's knight sits comfortably on e5, but it's not easy to make progress. If white tries to blast open the center with f3 and e4, this can be well met by the counterstrike c5, adding pressure against white's d4 pawn, making it less desirable to play e4. Grandmaster Caruana demonstrated the positional subtleties involved in the Stonewall with the strange-looking knight b1. His idea is to play c takes d5, once again provoking c takes d5, giving up protection of the b5 square, so white's knight is ready to play knight c3 to b5, adding pressure against the important dark-squared bishop. Black has no shortage of interesting ideas to consider, including centralizing one of the rooks on d8, blasting open the center with c5, or as Grandmaster Carlsen played in the game, the surprising bishop takes e5. We mentioned black typically wants to keep the dark-squared bishop on the board, but after d takes e5, the center will remain closed for the time being, when black reminds white there are still 63 other squares besides the one on e5. White's dark-squared bishop is restricted by the space-gaining e5 pawn, and black is prepared to play around this pawn with knight e4, leading to a complex middle-game struggle in which both sides have their fair share of chances. Notice that bishop a3, skewering the queen to the rook, is not really that serious of a problem, as not only can black play c5, the knight on a6 can prove its worth with knight b4, restricting the enemy dark-squared bishop. In this particular encounter, Grandmaster Carlsen went on to win the game. The Dutch defense is a provocative choice against d4. Gradually fighting for equality is thrown out the window as black seeks to imbalance the game from the very first move. This opening does appear anti-positional, and immediately weakening the king side is certainly not without its problems. White has several ways to positionally challenge the Dutch, but black is certainly not without dynamic resources, especially the lingering prospect of a kingside attack spearheaded by the f-pawn. Thanks for exploring the Dutch defense, and best of luck the next time the f-pawn makes an appearance on the very first move in your game, right here on Chess.com.